I'm Big Don Luca, smoke you like my hookah. Pump fake right, then I step back in illusion. That's a boss move maneuver, billionaire entrepreneur. Mark Cuban on the viewer, put you rookies on a skewer. I stay shitting on you boys like I came up from the sewer. Used to have a lot of dollars, now I got a lot fewer. What you saying to me? I hope you save it for me. I'm about to kill the game, and I put it in my testimony.
Hi, welcome to the Mainstream Mavs podcast. This is your host, Will. I'm joined here by my co-host, Jaren.
What is up, guys?
Today, we are going to be getting back in the swing of things, finishing up the season and reviews that we have just egregiously procrastinated over here. But, if you guys did listen to our last podcast where we kind of got back into the swing of things, of course, obviously we've had some run-ins and some bouts with our good fellows over at Twitter support in terms of our old account on Twitter at mainstream_Mavs, and it has halted our progress here. And obviously it's a sticky situation. But what's a tried and true podcast about the Dallas Mavericks that doesn't have to face some adversity? We're very in lockstep with the Mavericks in that same vein, because they had to face a lot of adversity this season, and it might end up paying dividends in the coming draft. And we're kind of hoping that our situation will bode the same results. Jaren, it's been a minute since we've been on the microphone. We're ready to dial out the season in reviews here for Reggie Bullock, Maxi Kleber, and Tim Hardaway Jr. Wrapping up the role players here before we head on to Luka and Kyrie. And then we, get kind of steadfast within our draft profiles and things of that nature. We'll be talking about some current events. Obviously, there's a lot of rumors going on right now. But many of them probably false and probably severely overblown, especially the one, involving LeBron James and the Dallas Mavericks. But it's all, good talking points at the end of the day. How have you been, Jaren?
We've been good over here in the 214. No, in all seriousness, been pretty good. How about you, Will? Let's have a little live discussion on the pod.
I've been, churning through life, but at the end of the day, I feel like my life isn't completely validated, nor completely whole if I don't have this podcast.
Agreed.
And I appreciate you guys for listening and sticking with us amidst our troubles and our adversities. If you're still listening through this little sort of triumph that we've had over the last few weeks, just with our Twitter account getting revoked, and us just not getting content out at the clip or rate that we wanted to, kind of because of that. And we really do appreciate your guys' support. So I'm feeling a whole lot better, to answer your question now, Jaren.
There we go. I like that.
But nonetheless, excited to get into these player profiles. Obviously we have not amassed too much of a following on our Twitter yet, but we're hoping to get those numbers up, hoping to engage you guys again. And but we're still, getting some decent numbers on these podcasts, which shows that day one listeners are still out there supporting it. So we really do appreciate that. We're going to be cycling through a lot of content throughout the coming days before we get kind of back in the swing of things, just to catch up. So things will kind of come out at a absurd, sort of erratic pace here as we proceed over the next few days, as we wrap up our player profiles, as well as our draft profiles and everything of that sort. You'll have an abundance of podcasts to listen to after a complete drought. So, it's just the philosophy that we adhere to over at Mainstream Mavs Podcast. But we need to fix our procrastinating tendencies, as the Mavericks need to, just like Jason Kidd needs to fix some of his tendencies and out of timeout scenarios. Jaren,
Jeff Van Gundy's the answer.
Yeah, Jeff. See, we've missed, far and away too much over here. Nonetheless, we better just get right into it here. So without further ado, here's an ad from our sponsor, Spotify for Podcasters. All right, Jaren. So getting into it here, obviously we are going to be wrapping up all of our player profiles, concluding with Luka and Kyrie. here in the next couple of podcasts. But we do got to finish these role players up, before we get into our draft profiles and all the, sweet, savory content that we have planned over the next few weeks as we lead up to the NBA draft here, where the Mavericks have the optionality to be able to deal their pick, move back in the draft, or select a young player. It has been reported by many, as well as Tim Cato, that they are pretty keen as of right now to trading the pick, but we'll obviously have to see what situation prevails itself and what happens. It's an exciting time now that we have veered away from the whole tankathon project, and we can actually start getting excited about a new season without feeling an abundance of sorrow and pain and just general discontent, because that was kind of the end to the season there. But a guy that can reciprocate some of those feelings throughout certain points of his season, but you also kind of get the ultimate highs with him. Mr. Streaky himself, Tim Hardaway Jr. We're going to be starting off with him in terms of our player profile today, Jaren. So in terms of Tim Hardaway Jr.'s past season, Jaren, he's obviously troubled, injury riddled a little bit at the beginning of the season, and he was shooting the ball terribly. His name was on the chop block. Mavericks fans were ready to ship him out for Ben Simmons. It was looking pretty grim. I could pull up some trade packages that I made back in October or November, and I think that they would definitely be a laughingstock on NBA Twitter as of right now. But nonetheless, Tim was able to sort of re-up his value into, maybe the neutral tier or possibly even a positive tier, just depending on, the team and, or another team for that matter, and their need for shooting. And, could he have played his last game in the Maverick? That question is to obviously be answered this offseason. But nonetheless, he is a contributing role player that has the ability to contribute, in a winning way on a championship team. And he tends to do so, towards the playoffs year after year. But, he does have these, pretty, triumphant downwinds where, he is just shooting catch and shoot threes at the top of the arc, like 5 feet behind the line, and he's not able to make anything. And, fans are calling for him because his shot diet is just so egregious. And, he's shooting at a 20% clip, and, he has the tendency to get lost on defense, though. It may be something that he, we may see, or, later in this podcast, that he kind of improved upon in certain areas this year. But, I would definitely say he's one of the more volatile players on this roster in terms of his future with the Mavericks going forward, from the perspective that he could, still be contributing and, be a very equitable and, very important player for the Mavericks this coming season. But he could also, be in Miami. But, with the Heat's recent success, the door may have closed on that one. But, there's always Minnesota. There's always Salt Lake City. I mean, we have an abundance of options at the table here. Just throw Tim up in the Midwest and let him. I'm just joking. We don't want anybody rotting in the Midwest. I did that for far too long. But in Tim's case, if he does get dealt, hopefully, I do wish him the best, because he has been an ultimate pro in his time in Dallas, to say the least. So, Jaren, Tim Hardaway Jr. this past season, what do you think were some of his biggest strengths, and also what were some of his worst weaknesses? And obviously, in these player profiles, we diagnose this for every player, even if they've been in the league for like 9 years, and you can make your generalization before going into it. We just kind of want to really decipher what we thought the best strengths and weaknesses, because they can change from player to player, year to year, right? They can, even if it's marginally, some players may have done something better a little year. Even when you get guys past their prime, you start to see them fine tune their game in different ways year after year. So, what do you think Tim Hardaway Jr.'s biggest strengths and weaknesses were this past year, Jaren?
Yeah, I think, Tim improved if honestly in a lot of areas. I think consistency being one of those, I think that there's arguments to be made there because again, I think if we're going to prove one of his weaknesses, it's probably consistency as well. But I still think that in a way was almost a strength of his. I think, more so than not, he was on or at least average. I think he found a way to be present in games where even though he wasn't shooting well or wasn't necessarily having the biggest impact on games, he was still able to, find a little fingerprint in the game, whether it be, just a few clutch 3-pointers or, something offensively that he did. I think he found a way to impact games. I think it's probably the best way to put it. I think at times pre-Kyrie that, and this is very weird saying, but I really do think at times, there was some sort of argument to be made that Tim Hardaway may have been the quote unquote second star or second player in this sort of role that he was given. Just, with the way that the Mavericks were using him through their offense, it was very shot heavy and very, Tim Hardaway heavy in the sense that if you have an open shot, take it. And I think he shined in that role. I think that, in the role that was given to him, I think he shined in it. And I think that's probably his biggest strength so far. Because, aside from his foot injury, I think the last 2 seasons of his career, it's been a little awkward, I guess, for him. It hasn't been the best after that 2021 playoffs, but it hasn't been the worst. I guess probably the best way to put it. And I think he found definitely a way to sort of reinvigorate his career. Not, that he wasn't going to be a role player in this league at all, but I just think that he found some sort of positive value because I look at him as a positive asset now. A guy that, likely is probably our best trade package outside of that 10 pick. And could be shipped over this offseason. I know you listed a few places. So I think, from a strength
I wasn't
perspective.
listing those places like as actual
Well, yeah, I know,
trade
but you
targets.
didn't
But yes,
listen
yes,
the
I did.
Midwest, and I was thinking
Yes,
Indiana whenever you said that. So,
yeah.
no, but you do bring up good points from there. But yeah, strength wise, I think was increasing his sort of, I guess, his cost or his sort of just trade value, and being a little bit more consistent of a player. Now, if we're going to touch up on the weaknesses, I did say consistency was a power or as a strength of his, but I think consistency was also a negative of his. And, especially on the defensive side of things, I think, offensively, whenever things were going, his defense sort of followed up. I think that there was multiple times in the season where he had pretty good stretches of defense. It wasn't totally lackluster Tim Hardaway defense or the Tim Hardaway Jr. that we've come usual to see on the defensive end. I think if he could find some sort of consistency there where, maybe his shot isn't going in, but the defense not stays, but, at least is present, he might even increase his value just a little bit more. But, I think that there was some positives to take away from there, but even still, there was not as many sort of, I guess, spurts throughout the season where shooting was just coming to an absolute halt for him. But there was still some times where it was, you could definitely feel it on that team, especially pre-Kyrie. I think that's when everything started to feel a little less hopeful, and then Kyrie came in and definitely changed some things. But to me, I think probably the biggest weakness is just consistency on the defensive end. Not letting your offense dictate your defense, and we saw that pretty much as a theme on this 22-23 Mavericks squad. I think it's pretty fair to say. But I think he was sort of the catalyst of that sort of theme that I just said.
No, yeah. Obviously, Tim definitely had, more of a consistent season. I think just overall, when you date back to 2022, whatever it was, that mid-January game against Golden State where he went down and then he subsequently missed, the rest of the season as well as the playoff run. And he definitely looked a little bit hobbled, like it was hard to get back in shape at the beginning of the year. And I can attribute a lot of that to some of those woes and the some of the complaints by fans. But at the end of the day, I do think that he rekindled himself fairly well this year, for a guy that is approaching the wrong side of 30. Those things like that can be pretty concerning, amidst the starts of the season that he had. So just from a personal perspective, I'm glad that he was able to, kind of not reshape his career, but maybe reimburse his value. That was huge for him as a player. He did start making threes at a much better clip. I would even go as far as to say is that this was, surprisingly maybe one of his best seasons defensively, even, amidst the Mavericks. When just some of the league worst struggles that they had at that second half of the season, where they basically, conceded even a toddler to run free to the rim. But I mean, Tim, really, and it's funny because I really started to see it even later on in the season. He was able to serve as a pretty valuable cog for the Mavericks in terms of being an on-ball defender, and he was tasked with some assignments that were probably, unfairly delegated to him just because of the Mavericks' lack of personnel, in the surrounding wing spots. And, he had to guard some of the best players on a nightly basis. And, while Tim is obviously, still a guy that's going to get lost, amidst rotations, and he definitely not the best off-ball defender. He has a tendency to get caught ball watching, can be lackadaisical at times, and, while he obviously isn't, I'm not going to call him unathletic because he's a very athletic player, but I don't know if his athleticism necessarily translates as well on defense. Just, he's not the longest guy. He's not the tallest guy. He doesn't have the best lateral speed, things of that nature. Obviously he was still suffering on, but he was definitely putting in the most effort I think I'd seen him put in his career. And, for that, I do got to give him credit. I do think that he shifted a little bit and kind of diverted to, being more of just strictly a 3-point specialist. And, albeit, once Kyrie came onto the team, I wasn't really displeased at that role. There were different periods at the time where he was starting, coming off the bench, towards the end of the season, it really didn't matter because the team had no defense anyways. But I do think that Tim, started to, really kind of just, get those above the break threes going. He was coming off a lot more screens, where he would, a defender would go under and he would just kind of pull it. It was definitely not as, I felt like we saw a lot less drives, a lot less pull-up twos from him this year. But nonetheless, he was shooting the ball at a pretty good clip. I think he was still around 40% in terms of what he shot from three this year. After the pretty bad start that he had, that's still impressive. I think he registered a couple 30-point games, got hot a few times still. So, I mean, if he can, consistently be able to produce at this level and, carry on this skill set that's sort of irreplaceable, just kind of a microwave scorer like that. If he can kind of continue to bolster that throughout the course of his career, especially, for a guy who, maybe doesn't need to rely on athleticism as much, it can definitely bode pretty well for his longevity. So, in terms of a player perspective, I thought he had a really good bounce back year, despite the Mavericks. Obviously, the team wide, just a triumph, of course, but I think Tim himself had a pretty consistent year. Contrary to some other years that he's had, where it's like 30-point game, 0-point game. There were stretches maybe where he'd go a couple weeks kind of going like that. Where he'd be in maybe a micro slump. But overall, you felt like you were getting more of those just like kind of like 6 for 14 performances or average performances, and I'll take that over the inconsistency, even though if that means that I'm going to get a 31-point game every 3 or 4 games, because if you have baseline Tim Hardaway Jr., I feel like that gives you a better chance to win in a more wide array of games, right? So from that perspective, that was definitely something that I was happy he improved upon. Otherwise, Jaren, unless you'd like to add on to any more strengths and weaknesses he has, what do you think his biggest improvement that needs to be made by next year is.
Yeah, I mean, Tim, I think that there's, many improvements that he can make. But at this point in his career, there's really not much you can ask for. I think, on the offensive end, I think he's kind of found his bread and butter, but, just to improve a little bit, I think he could maybe increase his sort of like, not rim running, but sort of like, I guess slashing ability. I think if he got to the hole a little bit more, it might even make him a little bit more efficient, a little bit more of a tool guy other than just a 3-point shooter. He does a pretty good job of getting up to like his pull up shots or whatever. But I think there was very few spurts, like one against the Lakers, and I feel like one against Milwaukee or some team like that, where he was pretty aggressive towards the rim just in a few possessions. I think it was I know it was the Lakers, but yeah, he was aggressive at the rim a few possessions. He's able to either get easy layups or easy dunks, or just make it hard for the defense, keeping the defense true. I think if he could improve that ability, just sort of changing up his game ever so lightly, and sort of his like placement on the court, I guess on the offensive end, that would help him tremendously. I just think you know what you're getting out of Tim, which is going to be sort of a just sort of like pull up 3-point shooter, a guy who's going to shoot pretty much in any 3-point shot that he can get, or even a mid range pull up. But I think if he could add a 3-level scoring effect to him, that would be immensely huge. And not that because he has lost athleticism, especially after his foot injury. But even still, I think that that athleticism is still there. Yes, he's sort of coming on the back half of 30, but I think there's still a lot of life there. And I think I don't know if those adjustments will be made because again, that's a big ask of someone, especially this late in their career. But who knows? If he's asked of a bigger role, I think that he could definitely sort of fill those sort of shoes. And again, we don't know if he's going to be with the team next year because he is likely, the second best sort of trade candidate that the Mavericks have. So from that standpoint, I know that they're looking to make a lot of moves. So I don't know if he'll be here, but if he is, I would love to see him make that sort of change or make that sort of positive effect in his game.
Yeah, no, I would definitely second you on the fact that he did look a little more hesitant to drive to the rim this year. I think earlier in the season there were multiple times where I even remember us like clowning him on a few podcasts for like getting like rim stuffed a few times in dunks. And he was getting blocked a lot more. And I mean, yeah, you can probably attribute that to that injury versus Golden State, and just a general sort of maybe with that some of that is just confidence when you're growing up that you may not even have it anymore. Tim's not egregiously old. I believe he's only like 29 or 30. So I think that there's still some light in there in terms of his athleticism for him still to get back and to where he was at for another year or two. He does keep himself in excellent shape. He's down there training in Miami, maybe not quite the boot camp that Eric Spoelstra has running down there. But he would sure love to join them, wouldn't he, Jaren?
Oh, he absolutely would.
No, yeah, but obviously the Tim to the Miami Heat rumors and the whole like proposed Duncan Robinson trade swap and everything has been circling on Twitter really since last season, I feel like. But like I had mentioned, the Heat's recent success and them going to the finals and everything, I don't know how likely that scenario is anymore unless they lose to the Nuggets. So we'll just have to stay tuned for that, I guess. But Tim is a guy that keeps his body in excellent shape. He's really diligent about his preparation. That's one thing I've always appreciated about his time in Dallas. So if he is able to make a jump like that, that would obviously be huge for the team. Just to get a little more multi-dimensional offensively, be able to attack off closeouts harder, and go up and just get a layup up, draw some fouls. Our surprising stat kind of that we'll mention a little later kind of goes hand in hand with how Tim played offensively. I do think that he'll obviously need to shift to shooting a little bit more of those above the break threes, some of those just screw it shots when a defender goes under. Once he gets older and he obviously has to rely on that a little bit more, but with his athleticism, still kind of in the wheelhouse. Hopefully with a full offseason healthy, he's able to somewhat get back to that level, and become a little bit more multidimensional offensively, because the Mavericks, outside of Kyrie and Luka, that is obviously one of the places that they are lacking in terms of, having a lot of these one-dimensional sort of role players. So, that, and then you can always, ask for Tim to improve on defense. I thought last year was honestly like the best defensive season I've seen from him. So I just want to hold back, on that, from that perspective, because, I just don't want to ask too much out of the guy from that perspective. I was pleased with and pleasantly surprised with what I saw last year. So, I'll hold back my hate and all that stuff. For if Tim, really just comes into next season, if he is still on the team and is back to just complete idle defense out there, just being an NPC on the court, clocking cardio on one end and chucking threes on the other, maybe then I will some of those takes that I reserved, I'll bring out. But for now, I don't know how much more I can request from him on that end, so I think that that's a good segue into obviously we talked about his biggest improvements that need to be made by next year. What do you think the biggest improvement he made from the previous year? Now, albeit he obviously played 41 games, I believe he only played half of the season in the 2021-22 season. But for me personally, I would probably answer that question just in terms of his overall consistency and his shot, because it was looking really dim there in that first season under Jason Kidd for Tim. I don't know, I almost seemed as if just in terms of the spacing with the offense, the shift from the Carlisle style to the Kidd style was something that fans pointed out a lot in terms of something that may have served as an adjustment for Tim, trying to play a little bit more within Kidd's system, which I think is honestly I would classify offensively would just probably Kidd's offensive system, I'd say, has a little more ebb and flow to it. It has a little more player freedom. There's not as many plays being ran. I do think that in the Carlisle system, Tim was probably getting a lot more of those design looks for him. And, once he was able to adjust for that this past year, I would honestly say that was probably his biggest improvement, just adjusting to the flow of the offense and his shot making. But Jaren, of course, what would you say his biggest improvement from the 2021-22 season was?
Yeah, I mean, from those two seasons, if you're comparing them, they actually look relatively the same. There's a little bit of a drop off in terms of like field goal percentage from 21 to 22, but outside of that, they do look pretty similar. Me personally, I think his biggest improvement was just being a role, or getting a role within the offense. Because if I remember right, in that 21 season, didn't really have a role. He was just picking his shots whenever he got them, and sort of being the open corner shooter. Or open wing shooter, I guess I should say. But in this sort of case and this season, I think that he found a really big role, especially with the absence of Jalen Brunson. I think that he was able to shine on the offensive end and become a really big offensive figurehead within the system. I mean, whenever Luka was out pre-Kyrie, he would be headlining, those sort of ESPN games with the, I guess, like as a Maverick, which was, concerning yet kind of, I guess, for his case, kind of cool. So I think his ability to, be a role player within the offense and even especially the defense was probably the biggest improvement for me.
No, I would definitely tend to agree with you on that one, Jaren. What do you think Tim's sustainability rating is, Jaren? And if you don't mind refreshing everybody, what the sustainability rating kind of constitutes.
Yeah, so it is a 1 out of 10 rating. 1, of course, being the worst, and 10 being the absolute best. And with that information given, I think this one's a little tough. I won't lie.
Well, yeah, but describe it a little bit, like what exactly.
Oh, yeah, like sustainability. So yeah, sorry about that. I guess like sustainability, whether or not you're going to be on the team next year. whether or not you're going to have a role as a Maverick or even in the NBA, depending on who that player is. I guess it's probably the best way to put it. Like,
And just like injuries and stuff like that
yeah,
too.
injuries.
Yeah.
Yeah, like how much you can rely on that player, and the season coming. So for my sustainability, of course, that being 1 out of 10 for Tim Hardaway Jr. And this is probably the toughest one I've had to do. I'll probably go with a 5.5 just because of and that might be even a little high, just because of the amount of rumors that he's been in. And again, I pointed this out before, but he's like our second best sort of trade target or, sort of asset on this team, that we have to offer outside of the 23, maybe third best if you want to include the
Yeah.
27 first round pick. And just that fact alone, especially, the fact that this is a pretty pivotal offseason, that I would stick it at a 5.5. If he is on the Mavericks next season, I think that there's more luck involved than anything. Maybe a team just didn't want him included, his contract being too egregious or whatever it is. And so I think, if he is on the season or if he's on the team next year, good for him. I'm not wishing him gone. I actually learned to like him, and that's weird saying for me because I'm not a big Tim Hardaway fan, but I have learned to like him over this past season. So I wouldn't be opposed to it. But overall, I just think he's this roster with his current state.
Yeah. In terms of what my personal sustainability rating would be for Tim, I would probably pencil it in at about a 5. Just due to the volatility of the situation with him, him and Davis being basically the Mavericks' two biggest salary fillers if they do want to make moves, and Tim obviously being the more lucrative piece out of those two. If you're looking at this from an opposing team standpoint, in an offseason that the Mavericks need moves to be made, substantial moves at that. They have a few assets on hand, being Davis, plus assets to spice up Davis, or he's just a negative asset by himself, or Tim. He's a positive salary filler, so you add him in tandem to other pieces that obviously could potentially get you something, and adding either one of those two with the 10th pick, and the Mavericks, like I keep saying, are a few moves away, not just one move away. So we'll have to see, unless they somehow actually, swing the Davis for LeBron James deal that has been, thrown on the table by many talking heads here as of recently. But if they're not able to pull that off, then, you're looking at a wide array of options that they could kind of go with here. Just in terms of the different trades that they can make this offseason. It's almost like redundant to make fake trades this offseason. I know me and Jaren will still attempt to, but the possibilities are, I feel like, a lot more extensive than, maybe even last offseason and this past trade deadline. So the movement on the horizon is definitely going to be exciting to see from the Mavericks perspective. But knowing them, the move is always going to happen, and then
Daniel House.
and somehow they will completely flake on the offseason and do nothing. But in all seriousness, their hand is almost forced here, so I do expect something to be happening here. So we'll just have to monitor the situation accordingly. But yeah, in terms of Tim, he's as good as he is, and as much as he's meant to Dallas in his last few years here. Especially if you really came to grown him, not just as the basketball player, but as a person. It isn't looking the greatest, but I wouldn't say all hope is lost, just kind of depending on what the Mavericks do. So yeah, I would probably just have to go dead center and say a 5 on that. Jaren, would you like to tell everybody what the surprising stat for Tim Hardaway Jr. is?
Of course I would. Tim Hardaway Jr., surprising stat. May I add, this is actually really good. 62% of his shot attempts were all threes, and that is a career high by almost 8%, which is, in basketball terms, that's actually really crazy. So that's the interesting stat.
Yes, and that kind of points towards what we were talking about there, beginning at the pod, that Tim, did shift to a little bit more of a shooting centric shot diet, beyond that 18 to 20 foot range. He was taking a lot of threes wasn't really operating in the mid range much, wasn't getting to the rim as much, but wasn't too bad in those attempts. So that's why we found that one to dig out. But otherwise, Jaren, do you have anything else on Tim? And just in terms of any final goodbyes, if this is the last time we talk about him, in terms of a serious discussion on him before he's out in Dallas, this could be the last time, Jaren. If there's anything that you would like to thank him for, the floor is yours.
Yeah, I mean, in all truthfulness, he has been an A+ player, or at least A+ sort of guy, a dude, whatever. Yeah, teammate. There you go. Yeah, that's fine. He's been an A+ teammate for the Mavericks for 5 whole seasons now. And I would be lying if I didn't say, if you think about the Mavericks and you think about this era, there's no way you can't think about Tim Hardaway now, especially early Luka era. I think it's just one of those guys that just sticks with it, especially for how long he has sort of stayed with that Kristaps Porzingis trade being how awful it is in hindsight. He's at least been one of the very few bright spots in that sort of thing. And, I hate saying it, but, we did love him there. We did love his time here. If it is coming to an end, I would like to wish him luck wherever he goes. Maybe he's going to be back in the Rick Carlisle regime. We don't know. But yeah, I think that's probably the best way to leave it off is a good hold or a good heartfelt thank you. Thank you, Tim Hardaway Jr. Thank you, Mr. Vice himself. So Vice City.
I would reciprocate everything you said, Jaren. That was beautiful. So I mean, there's no other words I got for that. With that being said,
a little emotional.
Yeah, definitely. Let's just go ahead and move on to Maxi and save our tears for when the Buddy Hield Tim Hardaway Jr. swap actually happens. So Jaren, Maxi was obviously injured by that right hamstring tear, I believe. I think he got it sometime, I think it's mid-December.
Yeah, I think it was mid-December, yeah.
And then he ended up kind of not returning there till right after the All-Star break. It definitely took out a good portion of his season there, and it was almost kind of the defining factor of his season. I think he played just about 50 games or maybe a little more this year. But it was definitely a different season than we've seen from him in past years. One where I think fans had a lot of questions as to how much, the waning athleticism has affected his game. But then, conversely, he would also every once in a while, still have, just one of those lockdown defending sort of games where he's able to defend, at the point of attack when he gets switched onto a ball handler. As well as, be the low man and be able to rotate over from the weak side, and, get some blocks from some pretty talented guys, going up on the rim. But it just felt like we didn't see that as much this past year as we had in years past. What did we come to think, of this last year of the second most famous Maverick from Würzburg?
Yeah, I mean Maxi Kleber. So he actually ended up only playing 37 games.
Oh geez, I thought it was 50. I thought it was 50. That's
no. I remember it taking a good portion. That's why he said 50. I was like, that doesn't sound right. But I didn't think it was 37.
Yeah.
No, yeah. So he played 37 games. And in 37 games, if we're all being honest with ourselves, he didn't really do too much. I would say it was one of his worst, if not the worst, because there were such high expectations for him in his career, at least in Dallas. I know, and he's only spent his NBA career in Dallas, but that's just my personal take. I think it's probably reciprocated amongst most Mavs fans. But I think one of the things that we at least come to see is, even though it was a pretty bad season for him and especially for the team, that at least there was some positives, aka the buzzer beater against the Lakers and things like that. And also just the fact that he was able to come back from injury so quickly after a surgery that I think many thought it would be almost the end of the season. I think his sort of timetable of return was mid-March, and I think he came back either the very first week of March or the very last week of February. I can't quite remember.
He came
I
back.
do know,
He came back at the end of February.
yeah, end of February, yeah. But yeah, I mean, for him to come back, that early in an injury that sounds pretty gruesome. I mean, tearing your hamstring does not sound good at all. It sounds pretty season-ending worthy of an injury. I think that's pretty indicative of what kind of player he is. Now, granted, he didn't have the best season. Defensively, there was some times there where you saw that Maxi of old. I think there was a few games against Memphis, I want to say, where he had some pretty decent defensive games. And then there was just some times where it was just pretty much like a saloon door. I think his athleticism was definitely felt, or at least the waning part of it was definitely felt this season. I think we had to rely on him way too much than we probably should have. And we've been saying this now for the past 3 seasons, I think. And I mean, he's what is he 31 or 32 now?
He's 31 now.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, he just had his birthday. Like, age isn't becoming anything more of a positive factor. And I hate saying it, but his time may be waning. And especially if injuries keep looming. I know the season before, in the 21-22 season, he also had a pretty injury-riddled season, but he was able to find some good positives. I think he only played 57 games in that season as well. But yeah, I think if personally, I think if he could find some way to kind of stay healthy, and I think that's also the Mavericks' job, is to find him sort of a role, or find him a spot on the bench where he doesn't have to play those sort of 20 to 30 minute games. I think if he could find a good role in this squad, playing 15 to 20, that would definitely sort of elevate his career and sort of make it a little longer expectancy than what we've seen the past 2 seasons. So I think that that's not totally his fault. I think that's definitely some of the Mavericks sort of coaching or training staff. I don't know how, or I guess who controls those sort of definitely coaching, but yeah, I think that's probably some of the fault at hand. But on the court, offensively and defensively for that matter, it was just not very Maxi like. And there was some spurts, like I mentioned before, there were some spurts that were pretty positive. But outside of, the Lakers buzzer beater and a handful of defensive games, I didn't really feel like we got too much out of Maxi this season.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you really were able to holistically diagnose what Maxi had to go through this last year. And for a player that really made his mark in the NBA on athleticism, and then the 3-point shot was something that he obviously developed, kind of in tandem with Dorian there, as the Mavericks were, they suffered through the tank years. This is another long-winded Maverick here. Maxi's been on the team since the 2017-18 season. And, this is a guy that has, built his status in the league, upon his switchability, his weak side rim protection, and as well as his pick and pop abilities, and his ability to hit the three. And even his 3-point shot, he didn't look like he had his legs in it as much. There were stretches where he was making a lot, but it wasn't as emblematic of the 2022 playoffs, where if anybody remembers that first round series versus the Jazz where he hit like 7 or 8 threes, we weren't seeing stuff like that. And I'm not saying that Maxi's time is over. I still do think he can produce at a decent clip. He's only 31 when you really look at it, but the Mavericks have put a lot of wear and tear on his tires, unfairly so. That they've sort of overexpended him both in the Carlisle and Kidd era. Asked him to play a bigger, he's started, came off the bench, whatever. They've asked him to play much more of a bigger role than he was probably ready for, even at his peak of a role player. And we're seeing it sort of catch up to him with injuries here. But it'll be interesting going forward to see, if he is in a lesser role, if he does stay with the team, can he, rekindle some of that consistency?
Yeah, I mean, it'll be interesting to see sort of how much he can sort of get back, or, granted that he's getting a full off season now. I don't really know how much of a rehabilitating time he got after that hamstring injury. I just don't really know how much time he got to get back in shape and sort of work on his basketball skills before he sort of got thrown into the lineup. So I think getting him a full off season one where he can sort of fully rehab his hamstring and sort of get back at least some of the consistency I think that we've come to see with Maxi. It'll be really good and really beneficial for what he is. Granted, at the beginning of the season, with a full off season and with the role that he was given, this was pre-hamstring injury. I still don't feel like we were watching the Maxi of old. I think he was sort of working into it. But like many other Mavericks, and we're going to talk about one here in a minute with Reggie Bullock, it sort of takes quite a little bit of grace period for these guys to get into mid-season form. And Maxi, I would consider one of those guys as, you have to give him a little bit of a period just to work into basketball shape, get sort of into the regular season mood, and then we can see the Maxi of old. And I just don't think he quite got into that rhythm before that hamstring injury. And, we definitely saw it. And unfortunately, it dictated the rest of his season. But yeah, like I said, I think giving him a full offseason, giving him one where I think he can fully rehab that hamstring, because I just really don't feel like that hamstring was fully rehabbed and fully healthy at the time that he came back. I think it really sort of affected the rest of his season. So I think if we could see him get back to 100%, it would really benefit his career. And I mean, I don't know about you, Will. He's 33 now. I think there's real questions like, is this his last good season of basketball? Is this his second to last good season of basketball? I think that the clock is sort of ticking.
Maxi's
sort of his
31.
career. Oh, 31. Sorry,
Yeah.
31. Yeah, I apologize. Still, I think the clock is ticking.
Yeah.
I just don't think with his play style, he's going to not last long, but like with the injuries that he's sort of gotten over his career, and especially that hamstring injury, that's just something that definitely winds the miles down in sort of a career standpoint. So I think there's questions to be had. I know the Mavericks committed to him long term, and that was, of course, last offseason. But at this point, I think that there's definitely some questions to be had. But we'll see with a full offseason. I think he can definitely rekindle some of the 21-22 Maxi that we did become accustomed to seeing.
Yeah, and I mean the same thing like we'll talk about with Reggie, but a lot of those early regular season woes can, I guess in Reggie's case, he's obviously had it almost every year of his career, but I mean a lot of that can be conducive to that late season playoff run, having to expel so much defensively in those series versus Utah, Phoenix, and Golden State. You're asking role players to elevate upon an echelon that they usually do, and you can get away with that maybe one season. Can you get away with multiple seasons? Usually not. Usually that's when you got to kind of kick the tires and figure something else out. But in Maxi's case, his standing is just going to be really dependent on what the Mavericks are able to put around him. If they can find another stable rim protector, a tried and true rim protector, maybe even if they want to take that bullpen approach to the big man position, just a guy that, is at least kind of head and shoulders, at least one above the rest. There was arguments to be made that Christian Wood wasn't that, even if, I believed he was. You can go listen to our Christian Wood season review for our thoughts on that. But that situation also, kind of coincided with Maxi's in terms of his playing time, the whole Christian Wood thing. And that obviously was probably course, for discussion as to why, his minutes were somewhat inconsistent. That whole two-man lineup, looked pretty good together, but we never got to see a whole lot of time of it because of the whole Maxi injuries. I mean, there's just a lot of questions, if Maxi was healthy and playing at the level that, he's capable of playing or he has in his career, maybe, some different things persist out of the Mavericks this season. That, he was obviously, albeit unfairly, Maxi, had a pretty integral role to fill this year for the Mavericks. And he wasn't really able to step into it, due to those injuries and, due to that just weird sort of logjam that the Mavericks had at center, because, they had Christian Wood, Dwight Powell, Maxi, all guys that you can kind of mix and match and play together. But how well do all of them, fit together? And did we even ever see enough of the best pairing between those guys? And, at certain points of the season where some of those guys, asked to do things beyond their capabilities because they had to compensate for others that were out. It almost seemed as if this Maverick season was a sort of rotating door of injuries where like one guy would get healthy and then it'd be boom, another guy drops. It wasn't like multiple guys were out at one time for most of the season, which was a really interesting dynamic. So that'll be interesting to see, as we go forward, monitoring, how the surrounding wings and, bigs that the Mavericks are able to accrue defensively this offseason, if that can sort of change the scope for Maxi, if that can, 15, 20 minutes is, can prolong his NBA career and, you can still at least get a big body down there defensively, even if the verticality is waning a little bit in a reliable stretch four. But, that'll remain to be seen, of course. Jaren, what would you say, just real quick, because we've kind of talked about Maxi ad nauseum, what would you say his biggest improvement was from the previous year if you just had to pick something? And I mean, I don't even think it's necessary really to do the biggest improvement that needs to be made by next year because, we've talked about it here for, ongoing probably like 10, 15 minutes. But, I think it's pretty self-explanatory that it's just his defense and, his shot overall, just getting back to where he was at. But if he did make any improvements this year, what would you have to say it was?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably I mean, this again is something that you just have to kind of pull out of your ass. Like there's
Stretch.
really not much that you
Yeah,
saw on the court that was improving worthy, but no, we'll go with clutchness. No, I'm just playing.
I was gonna say.
I think just more of a team player. He's always been a team player throughout his career. But I think just sitting on the bench for as long as he did, not really getting to play every game in the season, and also just being a competitor. I think he was one of the guys that was sort of pushing the Mavericks into the winning category, or at least the attempting winning category, as the season sort of prevailed. So I think from a competitive standpoint and just being a competitor and a guy who loves the game of basketball, I think he improved in that standpoint.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think there was anything on the court that we saw that was too positive enough to at least sort of comment on. But yeah, I think just from a competitor standpoint, from a mental standpoint, I think he definitely shined out, especially with how awful this season was, in hindsight. I think he was at least one of the bright spots, just from a competitive standpoint. So I think that's
Yeah.
probably the thing that I would point out.
Yeah, I would definitely have to say his mentality. You listen to him in any of these interviews throughout the course of the season, and he was always just, uber ready to be steadfast in his rehab or progress and try to get back on the court. He was always really excited for his teammates, always uplifting. He's always been like that throughout his career, but I would definitely agree with you, Jaren, that it definitely seemed like it was highlighted a little bit more this year. He definitely just seemed like he was a little bit more ready for the moment. That playoff experience, even if he did have a sort of a down season, it definitely seemed like it hardened him a little. Example 1A would probably be when he had that utter meltdown and collapse in Memphis, and then the next night hits the game winner versus the Lakers. Obviously, it's one of the few examples we can point towards, but that's a lot of that is that takes a lot of mental fortitude and toughness, and to battle everything he did this year. If he's able to come out on the other side, I would definitely have to say his mentality is one of the bigger attributes to that. What would you say Maxi's sustainability rating is in a Dallas Maverick uniform? And this is another one that I think is kind of tough.
Yeah, I think it's tough. I wouldn't say it's as tough as Tim Hardaway, of course. I 1 out of 10 again. I would probably throw him a little bit higher than Tim. We'll go with a 6 with Maxi, because again, I mean, he is a little favorable. He's favorable, at least on the trade block. I think he's definitely a guy that we could probably see shipped out, just because of his sort of defensive presence that he has. I mean, he's definitely league known as being a pretty good defender. So I think from that
Not the
standpoint,
ESPN commentators.
no.
Most
Actually,
of them.
like nationally, like I think that he's very underrated. But I think from a coaching standpoint, people know his name. But yeah, I think he's definitely a guy we could realistically see on the trade block this offseason. Now I would say I'd rather have him in a Maverick uniform more than Tim Hardaway, just because of what he offers and what this team lacks. I think Maxi's way more valuable. And especially the contract that he will soon be on, or actually, I think as of this season,
And
he's
now it
on.
kicks in, yeah.
Um, Yeah, so I think that's much favorable for what we're getting out of him, assuming he can stay healthy. Um, that's probably why I would go with a 6. I think more so than not, we would probably see him back in Dallas, but you never know. I would say it's probably a 70-30 or 65-35 chance that he's probably a 35% chance being that he's traded. Maybe even a little higher. I'm not really sure of those odds, but yeah, I think a 6 is probably good with me. I think like I said, everything that he offers on the court is something that is in dire need for this squad, and more so than Tim Hardaway in my opinion.
Yeah, I would. My only question to that would probably be, are those skill sets in dire need to other contenders or other teams league wide? Just from the standpoint that for all the reasons that we listed negatively regarding the injury and the waning, athleticism, all the questions surrounding that, I think that those will maybe be magnified a little bit in regards to like trade discussions and that. I don't know if his value is positive right now, despite his track record as a pretty overtly positive player in a winning playoff rotation, even if he is at the back half of that. Um, I don't know, man. I think I would probably roll with another 5 on this one just because of the whole injury history and everything. But if we're talking strictly about his sustainability, in terms of being in a Maverick uniform, I'd probably say like a 6 or a 7. But it'll be interesting to going forward. 9 million, I think, is where he's at in terms of his contract, around what he's making per year. That extension has kicked in. I think that's pretty favorable on the new CBA, especially if he is able to tap back into what he was doing. But if he does, get caught in the loop with these injuries, then that contract is going to be looked, at an albatross, and we'll have to kind of reevaluate from there because he'll probably turn into a negative asset. But I don't know if we're that far gone yet. But I also wouldn't call him, a positive asset. I'd say Tim Hardaway Jr. is a, overwhelming, better asset than Maxi for sure. If we're looking comparatively. So, I could see him getting thrown into a trade, but he also is that sort of like mid-level contract to where, he's not as quick off the chopping block as I think a Tim or a Davis would be, or even one of the young players. But, in terms of a guy that could get moved at the deadline or, even this offseason, I definitely, wouldn't say that he has better than, I wouldn't say that there's like a I'm trying to think of how to word this right. My math is abandoning me. Forgive me, everybody. But I wouldn't say that, there's probably about a 1 in 4 chance or so, or probably, higher than a 1 in 4 chance that he is still shipped out. So, that's what I would probably roll with. Jaren, you're the surprising stat connoisseur for these player profiles, for these season reviews. I think we forgot to mention it, but we do a surprising stat, obviously, and a sustainability rating for every player in these season reviews. If you haven't already caught on, if you're listening to this, you probably listened to some of our previous ones, so you probably have caught on. But nonetheless, new time listener, Jaren, what would you say Maxi's surprising stat was last year? What were we able to find over here at the Mainstream Mouse podcast?
On the Mainstream Mavs podcast, I'll give a little hindsight for this one. In the 21-22 season, Maxi averaged 5.9 rebounds. I don't believe that's not per 36 minutes, but that's just his overall stat. And again, for the 20 and 21 and 19 and 20 season, he averaged 5.2. Now, per 36 possessions, which would land him at
per 36 minutes.
Or per 36 minutes, sorry. I completely bluffed that.
Yeah.
Which would land him at a whopping 3.6 rebounds per ball game. That would be, of course, his worst. And I think that's only I think that's probably why this is probably the best surprising stat, is because that's only entailing of his sort of waning athleticism and, of course, that hamstring injury that occurred. That's, I think, a career worst in the minutes that he's given.
Definitely actually, per 36, probably a worst.
Per 36, it is very much a worse. He averaged 5.2 in per 36 minutes. So, I think in that standpoint, like, it's just, to me, I'm going to knock that down to athleticism and injury. I think it's probably all the things you
Yeah,
can.
I mean, obviously the Mavericks, suffered at the hands of their lack of rebounding this past year, and that was one of the, biggest things in tandem with their defense that was just completely horrendous after the Kyrie trade. And I know there was a big call for Maxi and really all the bigs to get on the glass a little bit more, but I mean it was a team wide thing where just nobody was boxing out. But yeah, and from Maxi's perspective, he's never been an elite rebounder, but he's always been a guy that tries, and especially like he's never been the most talented offensive rebounder, but he's obviously been a guy that positions himself and does make a solid play on the ball, especially he's able to vertically kind of get up there, and I would attribute a lot of that exactly to that. So that's a good stat. Jaren, let's go ahead and end it with everybody's favorite, the two-faced extraordinaire. He probably the harshest dichotomy in terms of how his play varies from a few months of the year and until the turn of the year. It came a little bit later. I think it came after January 1st. It really didn't happen until about maybe mid-January, February, where he finally was in full stride. But Reggie Bullock, Jaren, how did he perform for the Mavericks this past year? And talk about the shift that we saw after those first few months of the season.
Yeah, I think Reggie, it'd be safe to say that he probably wins the biggest turnaround player of the league, being that for 4 months out of the year or out of the season, it's just complete and awful basketball. And then for the next 3 months, he's like the best corner shooter in the league. I think out of Reggie Bullock this season, we definitely saw more of an exaggerated sort of meme where, for the first half, or not first half, but up until January, he's not going to shoot more than 30% in a ball game. And after January, he's going to shoot lights out. It was more up until early February, whenever we saw the normal Reggie Bullock. But even still, I never think that we quite saw normal, quote for quote, Reggie Bullock. I think his defense was definitely a little questionable at a lot of points in this year. A lot of people were, especially after Dorian's trade, a lot of people were sort of calling his name out to be the number one defender or at least be a leader on that defense. And I never thought that we saw not any leadership, but I never really thought that we saw any veteran poise or sort of, really just a confident or just like anything that improved dramatically on that side of things. He's like probably the most 3-and-D player maybe in this league has to offer. And I think that both of those were definitely to be questioned at multiple points this season. So I think from that standpoint, Reggie's season was a little lackluster compared to the last few, even though it's pretty Reggie Bullock-esque. But I mean, he still found some positives. He still found some very low negatives. I mean, once he finally got into the starting role and got, I guess, like consistent starting minutes, we definitely saw things starting to pick up. But against Milwaukee, he had that weird sort of confidence break where they just kind of sat him out, just letting him sit down, get some confidence get some confidence back, whatever it may be, or a mental break, I guess I should say. And then I think it was against the Clippers whenever he first popped off for like 5 threes, and then didn't do that for another month. Like I said, like there's just some weird spurts throughout the season where things look to be on the bright side and then they just fall flat on their head. And then for, a few weeks stretch here and there, he'd have a really good shooting and a really good defensive sort of span. But I just don't think we saw the consistency that we've come to accustomed to. And, from that standpoint, I really just didn't like this season from Reggie. And I know we're going to get a little bit more into this as we go in, but it's going to affect his mainstream math sustainability rating. So,
Oh, yes. I would definitely, say in the same vein that Maxi was adversely affected by that long-winded playoff run, the Mavericks had made the year previously. I think Reggie was as well. I mean, he had never done anything like that quite in his career. I don't believe he'd ever got past like the first round in his previous stops.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I know he's on those Detroit teams. I think he made it like 1 year or so.
Well, no, yeah, even in New York, they lost the first
and then
round.
New York, yeah, they made it in the first round 1 year, but he obviously, despite having been in the league for as long as he has, wasn't really storied in the playoffs. And for a guy that was tasked with, taking on an even bigger role defensively, and, just like Maxi was, both guys that were tasked with pretty big roles beyond their capabilities that we didn't, really think were sustainable in that 2022 playoff run. It was only amplified for both of those guys. So, we're obviously, being constructively critical here, but, I'm not going to veer away from the fact that these guys were, delegated some pretty hard tasks here, comparable to what their, abilities are as players. For Reggie specifically, his point of attack defense, I think it just definitely dwindled a little bit. He looked just less laterally quick. He was getting bodied a little bit more. I mean, there were a lot of times where, he was kind of just getting took to the basket. I do still think his, off ball anticipation, his ability to just be a savvy team defender, those things still, stayed pretty tried and true to how he's played throughout his whole career. Not something that I think really got off track for him, but, his individual on ball defense, as well as, just how one dimensional he is. I think maybe two factors that probably depreciated from the year previously. And, obviously Reggie is, the primary example of, if, you think about a 3-and-D player in basketball, right? A guy who shoots, spot up threes, and then he plays defense at the other end. But even so, it felt like he was even like more limited this year. Like he almost had like no offensive capability at times, literally outside of shooting. I remember at one time he had the least amount of drives out of players that had played a certain minute total in the league or something like that. And, I mean, I'm sure he's probably up there year after year, but I don't know, like he wasn't even taking pull-up twos off closeouts or anything. I mean, it just felt like, it was 3-point, it was a corner three off, Maverick ball movement that, where the possession had sort of catalyzed, where the Mavericks were able to get dribble penetration from Luka, and then everybody just swings it around the arc to Reggie and he misses. And that cycle was at a sort of continuum all game. Or, he was hitting, and, he would occasionally get out in the fast break, but this is obviously a guy that, throughout his NBA careers and, does not have the biggest offensive repertoire. And, so what he does, he has to do really well. And, while the 3-point shooting numbers were good, I do think that they were a little bit misleading because, you talked about it earlier, Jaren, that you felt like we still never got the Reggie Bullock of old. I mean, I don't know. Personally, I feel like the numbers were kind of skewed a little bit because, Reggie would go off, yes, for these 5-6-3 games every once in a while, but, it wasn't as steady as the previous year where, you'd expect him to knock in a few every night. He'd have some of these 0 for 8 games, some of these games where, he was tapping into his Tony Snell bag, collecting cardio out there. He had a few stat lines where it was zeros across the board.
Yeah.
For, pretty long time there, like a rebound or something like that. He doesn't provide much else in terms of rebounding or passing, obviously. So, it was kind of a rough scene from that perspective. But can you attribute some of that to, his role as well as his age, as well as the, long-winded playoff run, of course. So, as far as Reggie's future in Dallas is concerned, I think the biggest improvements that he can make next year are also, going to be in the same vein as Maxi, where it's going to be conducive to, if the Mavericks, because I think Reggie Bullock I think he can be a role player on a championship team. I earnestly do. I don't think that he can be a starting role player on a championship team. Just given the wear and tear that he's kind of got on those legs. I just don't know if he's going to have the wherewithal to do that. That being said, the Mavericks are kind of, in a sort of precarious position to move him. He is around that sort of mid-tier level in terms of his contract where, he's on that, non-taxpayer MLE still from 2021. I think he's making around 9 or 10 million a year. So he's at that like mid-level contract where, you can definitely throw him into a trade to amplify things, but he's not going to be the spearhead of a trade, just like Maxi, of course. So, that's an interesting dynamic to monitor, of course. But I do think that he could get back to the Reggie Bullock of old, who's shooting 40%, maybe even a tad bit above that, just given the amount of minutes he has, even if it does take him a little bit to come into form, at the beginning of the season. It's not as drastic of a complete drop off and then, coming to life as he had last year. I definitely think last year was the most, exaggerated instance of that in his career. So I think that there may be hope at the end of the tunnel, but, last year definitely was not, didn't make me, feel a whole lot better in terms of, how his time in Dallas is going to be looked at going forward. But, not all hope is lost. So I don't know. I'm kind of, in a toss up with Reggie. The defense, if anything, is probably the most concernable aspect of all of this, because that was something that I felt like, tapered off from previous years, almost the whole year. It wasn't just something that automatically shifted once February rolled around. So, I think in a limited role, if the Mavericks are able to, add starting caliber wings, or, they kind of switch their play style up a little bit, and, Reggie's coming off the bench. I do think that, it could be a positive thing. He's still a really good shooter when he's tapped in. And, I think he can still provide good point of attack defense in certain instances. But, especially, he has a decent frame. He's fairly long. The Mavericks, I felt like, kind of asked him to chase around a lot of guards this year. And I would like to see them, be able to get some players that can do that a little bit better. Obviously they have one in Josh Green where they can kind of throw out guys like that. But, if they're able to get some of those bigger bodied wings, kind of use Reggie as that chess piece to be able to guard up or guard down, I think that would maybe eliminate some of the wear and tear on his legs, where he's having to chase around Steph Curry, Damian Lillard, guys like that, would, serve to prolong his career. So in terms of his sustainability rating, Jaren, I would probably go with about a 6.5, just because, obviously, while he was mentioned in trade rumors a lot throughout the year last year, he's just a little bit more of a difficult player to move, especially considering how he fared last season and his age. I may actually bump that down to a 6 now that I think about it. But all things considered, I could see a role for him on this team going forward. But, even if he doesn't get moved at the offseason and, he continues to depreciate, then I think he's for sure gone by the trade deadline. So, it's an interesting sort of thing to go forward. But what would you tally his sustainability rating at?
Yeah, I'm actually gonna sort of differ from you, Will. I was gonna think more on the line of a 5. I just think, with his age, and sort of, the lack of presence that he had last season, I think it's a lot to sort of digest for this team. I think there's a lot of moves to be made, of course, for obvious reasons, and I wouldn't be surprised if he's one of the names included, in sort of a package to move him along on a different squad. But I just think, granted, I think there are some sort of saving graces for him. He played a career high 78 games this year, which again, I mean, is very positive. But in the manner in which he did it in, I just don't think is too positive. For a guy that I just didn't feel like clocked very good sort of minutes on the squad. Yes, there was spurts as we mentioned, but there was some very, very, very negative sort of spurts, and I think that's one of the guys where the negatives definitely outweigh the positives. And I'm just gonna be honest. I don't think that this team has sort of the capabilities to go through another 4 months of Reggie Bullock's incapable shooting. And I agree with you. I second you. that I think that he is a championship level role player. But if he's going to be a Maverick,
Not a starter,
and
not like at the
yeah,
back
that's
of the
that. Yeah, that's
rotation.
the point that I was going to get at. If
Okay.
he's going to continue to be on this squad, and if he's going to continue to compete, I think that he's going to have to come off the bench. I think that that was likely the last season of him consistently starting. I wouldn't be opposed to him playing some spot starter minutes. Given an injury or just given a back-to-back sort of night where rest or whatever it have be, I wouldn't be opposed to that. But I think the consistent starting of Reggie Bullock probably has come to an end at this point in his career. Whether it be in Dallas or somewhere else, I just think that's probably the realistic option. And again, like I like Reggie a lot. I think he's a good player. I just think that realistically, I just don't really see him. I don't think he's a guy that gets moved this offseason. I see him as a sort of midseason move.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too.
Yeah, that like I just don't. I think he's too one-dimensional, I guess, or just not really a guy that you can sort of highlight in a trade package or even really include in a good trade package to sort of I guess entice anybody. So I think I see him more of a sort of one-for-one swap, or even a salary dump sort of thing. Or I guess
Yeah,
an
I
asset
just don't think yeah, my main point was like I just don't know if the Mavericks are like hard pressed to move him specifically. I think
yeah,
they have the ability, and for reason being that I think they have the ability to not include him in trades, comparable to even like Maxi. I think that they just have the ability to keep him, and then monitor the situation going forward and then get surrounding pieces and kind of see where he fits in the mix of that, versus some of these other guys. But that being said, I'm not, remiss to just completely reject the timeline difference between him and the Mavericks, in like Luka obviously, and him really starting to get on the wrong side 30 and his limited sort of one dimensionality as a role player. So there's a lot of things to take into account, but I do think that one thing that we can say definitively, as you mentioned, is that I don't think is going to be starting next year,
yeah.
barring some insane resurgence where he's just red hot to start the year, and you have to keep him in the starting lineup.
Yeah, and I'll make this one last point. And just before I do take that point away, or I guess before I do say my point, this is no knock on him as a man or as a teammate. He's an amazing player, an amazing role model in the community. So that's why I'm saying this a little lightheartedly. But I don't think that the Mavericks are going to baby him as much as they did this season. I think that he's more of a guy where if it doesn't work out, if he has his usual pre-January cold shooting and cold defense, then I could very well see the Mavericks just sort of cold sticking it and sending him in a trade that doesn't really have any positives outside of maybe a salary dump.
Yeah.
I just don't really see him staying on the Mavericks long, or at least too long, or having too big of a role. If he continues to have his sort of half-season drought, and I think that contrary to what I just said, I think that he was very much babied this season, in the sense that he got to take off a game or two. I can't remember how many it was. I think it was just one game, with sort of a mental break. I don't think that's going to be at all possible next year. And I think if the Mavericks ever do come to that point, that it'll likely be him sitting out due to him finding a trade and finding a new home. So
Yeah. Now, I
to
mean,
me, I think
obviously, tread carefully with mental health issues and all that sort of stuff. I don't know exactly what, if it was specifically because of his shot or something like that. Was it like I can't remember, to be honest with you.
that's what the narrative was behind it. It could have been mental health. It could have
Okay.
been
Yeah, if that's
maybe,
if that's the instance because he was in a slump, that's one thing. But I obviously won't assume anything he was going through at the time. But I will say as much that contrary to last year, there was a sort of over reliance on him just from the Mavericks' inability and their limited capital, not having that pick, and just a lack of assets in general to start the year last year, or even heading into the trade deadline compared to now. Even if they don't have those assets, are just basically forced to make moves. I think it was a little bit more of a comfortability play where you could, be like, all right, he was on the playoffs last year. He's earned this. We're just, our hand isn't forced to move him quite yet. We signed him to a deal the offseason before versus this year, he'll be in year 3 of that deal. I can't remember if he has a player option on the 4th year. Maybe a team option. I don't even know. But, obviously he is, approaching, his mid-30s soon. Yeah, I would agree with you, Jaren, that I think the decision makers in the front office, if the opportunity presents itself, whether it's this offseason or the trade deadline, I definitely don't think that they would be as hesitant to move him, or at least I would hope that they not be. So, we'll just have to see going forward. What did you end up finding, Jaren, for Reggie's surprising stat?
Let me pull this up real quick. I don't have it pulled up quite yet. All right, so I think again, just a little backstory, or not backstory, but oftentimes, people, whenever they're looking at true shooting or whether or not someone's a good shooter or whatever, they look at their free throw percentage. And I think what are you looking for? If you're looking at a free throw percentage, what's a good free throw percentage for someone who shoots, or I guess is known as a shooter for you? Like, what's a good or average three?
I'd say 80% or above.
Yeah. Reggie Bullock shot 70% from the 3-point or from the free throw line.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think that only sticks out to possibly his sort of depreciation that we saw over the last year in terms of shooting. I think that could possibly be a hint of what we might get to see, or what we might be able to see for the next year's coming, or it may have been just a weird season. I mean, who knows?
He's not getting to the free throw line much, obviously, just given the style of player he is. But that's always something that you kind of look towards, because especially in a year where he was so volatile, it seemed like you'd have these like 8 for 12 nights from 3, and then 0 for 10 the next night. You have to sort of think of what is this player's overall confidence, what's his overall consistency, in a real clutch playoff scenario, how much can I rely on him? Sometimes percentages can be misleading, so it's not a big dig, but it is something that that is by far and away a career worst. So I thought it was interesting that he only shot 70% from the free throw line this past year. But that being said, Jaren, unless you have anything else with Reggie, that wraps up our season in reviews for both of these guys, or all 3 of these guys rather. You can follow us on Twitter at mainstream214. That's where we'd be posting all our new stuff. We're trying to bolster our Twitter, get back out into the crowd, get push content out on there, as well as promote our podcast on there. So make sure to follow us there if you listen this far in the podcast. Make sure to follow us if you're watching on YouTube. Shout out to the YouTube gang, Mainstream Mavs Podcast on YouTube. Comment down below, who do you think out of all 3 of these players is the most likely to get moved? Also, make sure to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever else you listen to podcasts. We're on almost every podcast listening platform. Make sure to give us a 5-star rating and follow us or subscribe to us, or whatever the button is that it may be on that podcast platform you're listening on. We would really appreciate that. Or if you even gave us a review, we take all everything into account, all feedback we get from you guys. So we really would appreciate that. Other than that, we'll be back to churn out the rest of these player profiles with Luka and Kyrie, and then get steadfast on to these draft profiles. We're happy to be back with you guys, and this is Will, Mainstream Mavs Podcast, signing out. I'll catch you guys in the next one.
Bye-bye.